it had propagated through it, vaporized through it, through the heat of meteoritic arrival, a PGM, platinum group metal, palladium or platinum type metal, that when that vapor propagates through the glass, it creates the projective powder, the origin of alchemy and the transmutations done by John Dee, which is why they found that material in Prague.
Really?
We had found in our earlier visits that it was easier to lucid dream there, but now we understand more of the physics of why.
Wow, really? That's just incredible. I didn't know that. Do you know if there's other similar locations? Anything you've heard about?
Well, the principle is what's of interest. We originally learned about this in Australia when our friend Rob Gourlay had measured that the Aboriginal song lines were in fact measurable as DC magnetic conductivity in the soil. And where they crossed in a fractal is where they had sacred space. Now, if you think about it, the reason you can dream along a magnetic track measurable by a phase conjugate or fractal propagation of charge, you can see that that's not only where you can die well, but that's also where you have the possibility of non-destructive compression when high plasma voltages arrive from the sun. So the deep principle of Feng Shui is at the root, all the lines connect. And they can only do that in a fractal. Imagine a rose, the rosy cross.
Very, very interesting. And how would you, in regards to if we talk about this in the space of nature, we can talk about later on maybe a city or some of the spaces that are more, I guess, in one way toxic that human beings have created without this knowledge or built without this knowledge. But if we go into a forest, for instance, a nice area in nature, have you done any kind of measurement there? And generally, is that always a good space or good place to be in regards to the fractal properties of the location, or are there just some places that are not good for whatever reason?
Well, I think obviously it's true that nature is beauty here, but as an example of how to understand why, when Krakow was measuring the kids who were able to see without their eyes, the exercise they were taught to do was imagine themselves in beautiful nature. At that moment, he measured that they were flipping an electric switch in their aura and they would become fractal. So even imagining yourself effectively in nature, your aura gets measurably more fractal, triggering the peak perception. But in physics, if you simply sit under an ancient tree, an old growth tree, you'll notice that your vision gets more clear. The physics is that perception is caused by phase conjugation, perfect compression. So, when Karatkoff measured golden ratio in brainwaves, he was measuring phase conjugation. And that means compression perfected. And that's the cause of perception. And that tree is a perfect electrical branching algorithm. It's fractal.
Yeah.
And that fractal field is precisely why perception is enhanced.
And a tree won't grow in any other way either, I guess. I mean, it's always going to balance itself perfectly. It's only going to put energy into where it's the least amount of, I guess, in one sense, resistance, or however we want to term that, and therefore it would always come out in the best way possible or in accordance with the tree's surrounding. Isn't that right?
Yeah, this funny story comes to mind. We were in Netherlands, and there was a beautiful old forest, but there was one tree that was dying, and we tried to figure out why. We put our spectrum analyzer in the tree, and we got a frequency, I think it was around, 72 hertz, a spike that should not be there in its capacitance.
Mm-hmm.
And we looked around and we saw there was a large metal fence, a massive iron fence, about, 30 meters away, and the fence was pointing directly at the tree, its corner. Now that is obviously the essence of horrible feng shui, but now we understood the physics. We put our capacitor over that fence, and guess what its frequency was? Its frequency was precisely the frequency that was killing the tree. So that made the tree harmonically exclusive and no longer inclusive, and that's what killed it.
That's really interesting. So is anything that we create or shape that hasn't this type of structure, is that gonna kill things basically that are living in its surrounding?
Well, biologists and architects need to know why every living thing is based on golden ratio 5-sided. Every living protein is 5-sided for a reason. And if the biologists and architects understood the electrical reason why, then they would never put you in a square metal house. And that's very simple.
Right. And do you think that this is stupidity, or is there...
Yes, I think it's, yes. I don't consider myself smart. I consider this stupidity. Yes.
So there's no other reason, because in one sense, the feeling I'm getting here as well is that if we look at some of the more ancient cultures that have specific ways of building their houses, we have the yurta, or whatever it's called, from
Yes.
the Tibetans, their tent, which in itself hold a sacred geometry, if you will.
Yeah.
But somewhere along the line here, it seems to be that the modern, quote unquote, civilization has lost this knowledge and started to build these square houses. What have you picked up on anything here? Why did they change?
The essence of the stupidity is not to know what is a bioactive electric field. Once you understand that, for example, you could take a wonderful Tibetan yurt, and if you put wire string around the damn thing, you just killed it. So it isn't good enough to just imitate your ancestors. You need to know the principle. And here's another really example of this stupidity. You have millions of people who are paying big money to go to the Acropolis in Athens, Greece, right?
Yeah.
They're calling that a sacred space. Now, in fact, the paramagnetic stone, the magnetic lines there actually could create charge compression and thus be sacred because it would trigger life. However, the local stupid fools, they surrounded the thing in all kinds of metal wires and ropes. They put metal all over the place and killed it.
Huh.
Now, that is an example of, the gods must be crazy. They're worshiping the Coke bottle again.
Well,
so
there you go.
My advice is stop worshiping Coke bottles and get to the pure principle.
Yeah, well, that's right. So, okay, so that means still then that at least in terms of some ancient structure, they have this incorporated there, and they've kept that true. But it's the modern man in that sense that doesn't get it, right?
Yeah, I mean, these people, they call themselves scientists, but they don't have a clue what life is. So I have built phase conjugate dielectric capacitors, a resin. And inside that field, I've measured a 50% increase in fermentation by measuring glucose uptake. I have made phase conjugate magnets, where we've measured up to a 300% increase in growth in water treated with phase conjugate magnetics. Now, physics knows, phase conjugation means basically adding and multiplying waves, just like conjugal relations when you get married with your genes. The phase conjugates in optics is well known to create self-organization, well known, and time reversal. But phase conjugate dielectrics, they're just coming to recognize, also make self-organization. And I've learned how to make phase conjugate dielectrics. Tom Bearden wrote a lot about that. But no one up till now has invented phase conjugate magnetics. Phase conjugate magnetics, which I've invented, starts when the like poles of a magnet attract each other. And at that point, you can begin to assemble devices which have an effect on water, which will revolutionize all of water purification. I mean, I'm talking about turning sewage water into drinking water almost directly.
And does this mean that you, with the electromagnetic field, are drawing out all the toxins, and what's remaining is a good, clear water, or how does it work?
It works very simply. If you visualize two vortex meeting each other on the head of a pin, like two pine cones coming together head to head, which is how the two laser beams approach from opposite direction in phase conjugate optics. At that point, when the two tornadoes swallow each other head to head, it's called phase conjugate. The symbol for that is two triangles approaching, which is called the Mogen David. It's the flag of Israel.
Mogen David, okay, right.
Yeah, but if two triangles approach head to head, they phase conjugate, which is the geometry of Orion and a whole bunch of stories. Anyway, so if you do that with magnetic lines, you create phase conjugate magnetics, and then the like poles of the magnet will attract. And in that geometry, you're creating perfect compression. Now, perfect compression means that the centripetal forces become non-destructive, which means the compression is perfect. It's a perfect squeeze. So water that goes through there experiences phase conjugate magnetics. And it's just like you put it through an incredibly beautiful centrifuge at a molecular level. And out the other side comes increased sedimentation rate. The cause of that is the same reason that you can sort your dirty clothes in your washer by using a spin cycle.
Very interesting. So is this, are you in the process of working with a device that can do this right now? Is it already developed or?
I'm taking my next prototype for Paris for testing tomorrow by water research agencies. Yes.
There you go. Okay. Really? That's really interesting. And what, I mean, have you mentioned many different, like what seems to me then, I'm not all that familiar with all the things that you've been working on, Dan. But do you have at this point like devices? You mentioned regarding the heart, was it tuner you mentioned, or
Heart tuner? Yeah.
Heart tuner. Is this something that you have available on your website, or tell us more about
Yes.
that? Okay.
Yes, at goldenmean.info/heart tuner special, you'll see my invention, the heart tuner. I invented the mathematics to measure heart coherence.
Mm.
It's called a cepstrum. It's a second-order power spectra. Just measures the internal phase coherence of your heart. Before this, mathematicians thought there was no way to measure internal coherence. I proved them wrong. So when you measure internal heart coherence, you can kind of measure love in a way, because if you say I love you and you're telling the truth, your heart coherence will go up at that instant. And the physics is simple. Perfect coherence is fractal, and that's a perfectly shareable wave. When you measure for phase coherence, you're actually measuring for pure intention, which is literally a wave that's perfectly shareable.
Very, very interesting. And how about, I'm thinking about when you talked before about the Aborigines, their song and so forth, and if we go back and take that into context of nature again, I just wanted to ask you, wing this by you, see if you have any input on it. Bird song, I've heard, for instance, is one of these wonderful things that actually helps trees to grow. They've taken the frequency of bird song and measured in two different, I guess in their own kind of controlled environments, and came up with the idea that you can even synthesize bird song, and it creates enables plants and trees to grow faster and bigger. And have you heard about this, Dan?
Yeah, the sonic bloom invented by Dan Carlson almost 20 years ago now. He was an old friend. They documented the mechanism there. It was that the critical ultrasonic frequencies of the bird song phase lock the stomate surface on the leaf, massaging increased foliar feeding. So the physics is pretty well known on that. But the bottom line was, yes, they were using a trace growth enzyme in a trace mineral spray on the leaves in combination with the bird sounds and achieving exponential growth increase, called sonic bloom. Dan Carlson.
Very interesting. Okay, well then it's known then. It is something that just came by me the other day. I haven't heard more about it, so I didn't know that it was this elaborate, and I think people have been working on it for such a long time. But there's other things here as well in regards to, well, you talk about bliss all the time, for instance, or the science of bliss and how this can be achieved. Is this something, would you say, that we can work on internally in regards to how we deal with our own emotions, or have you looked at this primarily from the perspective of having an external device with a specific frequency or voltage or electromagnetic field that influence us?
Yes, we'd like to suggest the focus be on what's called self-empowerment, which is the ability to make bliss for yourself from within. But the fact is, the electrical definition of bliss is very teachable, and that is when your body gets fractal as identified by golden ratio in the power spectra. For example, when Karakov measured peak perception or bliss in the kids who could see without their eyes, one of the primary determinants was golden ratio in EEG, brainwave harmonics, and specifically golden ratio in the ratio of the key frequency of alpha versus beta in your brainwaves. So I built an invention based on that idea of golden ratio in EEG to teach bliss, called the Bliss Tuner, the first of its kind. And indeed, we can teach bliss process. And the nice thing is that when you use biofeedback to teach you to shift gears in your brainwave to achieve golden ratio, which is harmonic inclusiveness optimized, when you make golden ratio in your brainwaves, you experience charge compression, and that's called bliss and peak perception. And we've had people make as many as 5 harmonics in golden ratio. There's lots of precedent for this academically for people who are deep into neurofeedback. goldenmean.info/clinical intro. You'll see the whole story of the history of the measurement of bliss. But it's now quite clear that bliss and peak perception are defined by fractality or phase conjugation optimized by golden ratio. It's very teachable. The point is that as the more you're able to achieve the bliss state, the more your aura gets big. And that's a predictor of your ability to take memory through death, as predicted by ability to lucid dream.
Tell us more about that. The memory through death, to me, sounds a little bit like life after death, but I guess it implies that we personally aren't there in one sense, but our memories are taken on further, or they're living on further beyond us, or Tell us about it. What do you mean?
Yes, we have 4 or 5 one-hour videos on our website about teaching the science of successful death from an electrical engineering viewpoint. Again, some of this was inspired by our friend Dr. Korotkov in Russia, his book Life After Life. He measured the time it takes